Kate Wilson, and here's a new episode of All Access DNA. Today, we are talking with Dr. Jeremy Koenig from the DNA of Things podcast to talk about athletic performance and genetic testing. Jeremy is a PhD biochemist and a former professional athlete. We actually did a podcast swap where he interviews me on the DNA of Things podcast about access to genetic healthcare and the future of genomics. Check that out on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcast. Let's get started. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Kate. It's a pleasure to be here.
So one of the things that we want to talk about is genetics, athletic coaching. And I really want to get into that because it's an area I'm not as familiar with. But I really wanted to figure out first kind of what led you to genomics before you got into the athletic coaching and genomics together.
Yeah. So by the way, thank you for sending the questions ahead of time because it gave me the opportunity to do a bit of a retrospective on how the heck did I get here? Because I certainly didn't design it. I can tell you a bit of an origin story. It was really like three things clicking all at once when I was about 16 years old. And the first was this high school cloning project that I was doing. It was like this restriction enzyme study of like cloning a bacterial DNA with an insulin gene. And I just stayed up all night finishing that thing. I just couldn't put it down. The second thing was I was actually an amateur boxer. I was training, like heavily focused in sport at the time. And I just happened to see this Scientific American Journal of transgenic mice with these mice growing on the backs of ears. So basically, you remember that? Yeah. And it was around the time that I think Mike Tyson bit off Evander Holyfield's ear. And I was like, oh, I think I can fix that now. So yeah, I mean, it was an absurd like juxtaposition, but that's two images that stuck with me. And, the third was, much more personal, and perhaps the one that really, really matters is my mom was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And, the doctor told us, quickly and almost dismissively, like, don't worry, it's not genetic, like, to ease her mind so her kids wouldn't get it and us too. And, that sentence really opened up one question I couldn't put down. I was like, well, if it's not genetic, then like, how do we know? What does that mean? And actually, quick distinction, you asked me about genomics and, the words genetics and genomics, guilty as charged, they get used interchangeably whereas, genetics is single genes. I know I don't have to tell your audience this. And, genomics is the study of a whole genome and how they interact. And, that was something that my mind really got opened up to when I went to university into a molecular biology program. Initially, my honors project was with Melanie Dobson. I mentioned she's the first female Rhodes Scholar, first human to see the Y chromosome sequence in Ed Southern's lab. But then I met Ford Doolittle. He's my genes and genomes he's my undergraduate professor, and I went on to do graduate studies with him because he really opened, my imagination to this whole world of DNA far beyond that I ever thought possible. And he said something that, in that class reframed the whole field for me, which was, he said, don't think about genes as like catalogs of functions. Think about genes, the gene's pinnacle function, if you will, as the transmission of information from one generation to the next. And, that genes, by and large and simply and in their most reducible unit, have evolved to be transferred, and they are selfish. Of course, this was around the Richard Dawkins time, right? I thought it was fascinating. I don't fully ascribe to that paradigm now, but it was enough to really get me captured into doing my PhD with Ford. And I went on to do my postdoc with Ruth Lay at Cornell University, looking at the gut microbiome and the human genome. And coming back to the thing that Ford said was what really got me looking at people as, and every biological entity is this like, 4 billion long conversation that's going on inside of all of us. And so that's really what captured me into the world of, genetics, specifically in genomics, genes and genomes. Yeah.
No, I love it. I love that you talk about like it being a conversation because it's interesting that you have the background too as researcher, PhD, heavy academic, but then you then form or translate it into this company, this test on athletic genomics. I use genomics and genetics interchangeably as well. But it's taking it out of that academic research context and how do we apply it in like, what at the time was a pretty new area, I'm thinking. Like, I don't think there was a ton going on in that space when you were starting out. So how did you take that kind of, I would say more of like a traditional background, getting a PhD and move it into this area that was very not traditional? or
Mhm.
genetic?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned I was a boxer when I was 16, and, I hung up my gloves when I was 18 because I learned pretty quickly, despite, having success at the sport. In order to get that success, I was sparring with guys my twice my age, weight, and experience for, 3 hours a day. And getting your bell rung even only 50%, it's not a good look, and it doesn't help with the genetics homework, so to speak. But, one thing about me is like I always have learned through movement. These were ADHD days in which I, fit the profile to a T. And I guess my therapy was movement. And the fact is, well, when I went into undergrad and PhD, excuse me, I was, very, very much needed to pair my academics with some form of athletics and movement. And I just kind of like looked at the landscape. I was like, where is it socially acceptable to spend 20 hours a week training? Because I just knew I needed that to untangle my mind, if you will. And so as all of this kind of undergrad and even PhD work was happening, I discovered track and field, and I got a great coach, and I was, in collaboration with him, finagling my way to becoming a walk-on national caliber sprinter. And if you could imagine, with no background but just great coaching and maybe some innate capability, was able to go from walk-on to team captain to conference champion, national finalist, and competitor at the Olympic trials in Canada in sprinting. And sprinting is a sport where like the margins are hundredths of a second. And so I was really thinking like a researcher and doing experiments on, oh, hey, what does my metabolism do under load and under training load, which is the stress that causes the adaptation, right? And it's a strategic stress. How does nutrition, shift the response curve? What's repeatable? What isn't? And so, no, you're right. Nobody was teaching performance genomics. It didn't really exist. Didn't even realize that I was thinking about it that way. Although, yet I hadn't measured myself genetically, but the questions, had started to form. And the intersection really started. It arrived, I suppose, after my postdoc, and this technology became available. So I had my bioinformatics training. I had a long list of injuries. And I had my 23andMe file, right? And so, around that time also, there were some of the early performance genomic studies were being published. And I remember reading them thinking, hey, I could have used some of this information previously. Like I had a lot of trial and error with what training programs worked, what didn't, a lot of injuries that in hindsight could have been avoided. And so I was thinking, well, if I had this information, would have trained differently. Well, maybe others might also. And that was really, I suppose, where the moment that fused these two passions in both athletics and genetics. And so I had a great network in the sciences, and I had the great network in, the track and field network, world caliber coaches. And so that was really how it happened. I didn't plan it. It just was. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's how a lot of folks end up in careers that they never anticipated. It just sort of works out that way. One thing that I would like to dig a little bit deeper in, because you mentioned it when you're talking about like performance testing, athletic, genomics, genetics. It sounds like what you're mentioning is so like on the test product itself, so on the profiles that these athletes are getting, it's thinking about things in terms of metabolism, maybe how they can avoid certain injuries. So are they more prone to certain different types of injuries? How do they avoid it? Does it include anything like this is a gene that tells me you run fast. It's a fast gene. Or, you have this gene that's going to make you a better marathoner as opposed to a sprinter. So what are the types of things that you can find on these profiles?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just quickly on the word test, and I mean, I know you're
Mm.
probably a stickler for language also, like where these are not diagnostic, like getting an athlete profile. When I was looking at my athletic profile, it wasn't really like a test I could pass or fail. It was like more like it was an insight that that may or may not be relevant based on what my goals were. And that was like something that I learned in like talking to the athletes, because they did echo my sentiment, right? Where they basically, these were like now Olympic level athletes, so they were basically, aged, let's say 20 and over. And so they already survived the training. And so actually it's something that I'd point out that was an interesting observation in working with these, elite track and field athletes, the partnership with an organization in Paradise Valley in Phoenix, Arizona, like hundreds of the world's best track and field athletes who are trying to jump higher, run faster, go longer. Like a really nice, like objective measure, like compared to team sport, which is obviously a lot more complicated. But nevertheless, this would hold up across all disciplines, is that the athletes that were there, they had an overrepresentation of these injury protective alleles, right? Which would make sense that they would survive, they would have survived the training. And so that's getting into like, your call 1A, 1A1 type variants, for example, is like, injury protection. And okay, so they have injury protection. What if they don't? Well, then here's your, injury avoidance strategy potentially that could come from knowing these various collagen markers. But even to take a step back further, like some of the really cool research was like, you're probably familiar with it, your Mantiranta, I think his name was. He was a Finnish cross-country skier, and he won like 7 Olympic medals between 1960 and 72. And he had this like naturally elevated hemoglobin. It was like 65% above normal, and it was a result of this, rare familial EPOR mutation. And that was a publication, I think, back in the early 90s. But, he was somebody that was like tested for blood doping and it came back clean. And, he just had a whole pedigree of like ultra endurance athletes. Now, that's a rare variant. So it's not like you're going to find a common instance of that. But, I think what you were speaking to is, yeah, there's certainly like muscle fiber contribution composition. So things like, your actin 2, actin 3, variants. It's okay. Well, am I a natural sprinter or not? As evidenced by this study that seems to show all elite sprinters or most elite sprinters having these variants. So, in general, I mean, I think that there are certainly markers that, point to maybe an increased, let's say, innate training response. So once you expose the athlete to that, they're going to get an incredible result. Maybe the injury component side is, obviously interesting where, you can vary the stimuli, like the strategic stress in accordance with the athlete's vulnerability potentially that you may or may not have learned by trial and error. The coaches had in the past certainly have, and they tweak these programs. And so you have 2 athletes training next to each other and one's doing like 2/3 the training volume and getting better results. Whereas when they were trying to keep up, they were getting, constantly plagued with injury. And so those were like implemented and changes that the coaches affected based on having, years of documented record of the athlete's response to training. But, something I should have said is, the big question is always like, technically speaking, is what's the heritability of these traits? So like how much of the variation in a trait in a population is explained by, the variation. But then also, just because you have the sprint gene, it doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to be an Olympic sprinter. And as it turns out, much to my surprise, it's just because you don't have it doesn't mean you can't be either. Because there were a couple of instances of Olympic sprinters. There was a Spanish hurdler, I think, a 110 hurdler who didn't have the sprint gene. And actually, one athlete in my own backyard didn't have the sprint gene, and she went to the Olympics for the 1 and the 200 meters, right? So, yeah, it really isn't like a test and you're guaranteed to get a result if you have a particular profile. It really does beckon to, the right coach that's curious and is implementing different modalities and different metrics insofar as how do they nurture the athlete. And it certainly wasn't like I wasn't looking at a talent ID frame. It was really, these athletes are here. They have their roadmap defined, which is a first principles strategy for like the periodization of like basically the informed stress at particular points of the training protocol. But then how do you adjust that a priori with genetic information, but not ultimately and permanently, because the athlete is going to surprise you. And because, by the way, there are a bunch of hidden traits that we don't even know about yet. So it's incomplete science, but it's nevertheless better than what there was when I was sprinting, for example.
Mhm. Do you find that the athletes or the coaches or both understand how to use these profiles? Because like you're saying, there is some sort of nuance. It's not just a, hey, this is okay. Hey, this is bad. You can do this. You can't do that. Like, do you find that they're able to interpret this information and then incorporate it in their training programs effectively? Or do you find that
I
they
think,
need additional assistance for some of that info?
yeah, no, it was, that's where like, I kind of pressed pause when the product became too consumer. Like I saw pretty quickly as like, this needs to be part of an integrated approach. And when it is, the results are amazing. Sometimes, like, for example, like I had one 800-meter runner who, like, her strategy was always, lead the race from wire to wire and hold on, right? And then she found out that she did actually have this sprint capacity that was basically latent because she never dormant, let's say, because she never trained it. But we didn't like look at it and say, oh, well, you're an 800-meter runner and you have the sprint gene. This is all wrong. Well, let's start training for the 100-meter. It's like, no, you're world class and you're carrying this like hidden little gem. And so if we talk to your strength coach and we talk to your track coach and we talk to your physio, it's like, cause she had some injury markers as well, as we can, kind of run an experiment where we try a race where, with a little bit of training and activation, you're going to be a fast responder to sprinting. Can you change your strategy from lead wire to wire to sit and wait and out kick because you can run a 200-meter faster than the field? Or at least, that you have this kind of hidden talent. So, the short answer to your question is I don't think like today we can just like drop a genetics profile into the ether and expect that it's going to be leveraged to its full extent.
Yeah. Well, and I was wondering too, like, because you touched on, being part of like a program and not necessarily like a consumer comes in, purchases it, gets whatever they get back from it, and then has to figure out how to incorporate it, right? Because I think about where I live is a hotbed in the US of travel baseball. Like it is crazy. And I say that as somebody who has a son that plays on two different baseball teams. But, I could definitely see a lot of parents being like, oh, I should test my kid. I should get something like this for them, to help them get that additional edge, get them in, to playing college or go pro. Is that something that you have concerns over, or people kind of taking it? And because I think when you and I have talked about like developing products, when you develop these types of things, you can have an intended use, right? Or what I recommend, but you can't control how everybody's going to use it.
Yeah, we did speak about that. Like I can't personally guarantee if somebody's going to use the product properly. One of the use cases, the edge cases I shared with you previously is, I had professional teams reaching out to me saying, well, I want to profile my kind of lower draft picks based on their genetics. Because maybe they have some dormant talent or maybe they have an injury. And it's like, yeah, no, that's not what this is for. And that is in violation of so many ethics codes that, it's just not something to be engaged. And you can't, you might have teams try something like that, but I think they get in trouble pretty quickly. But I think with parents, that's a tricky one because like, I can't speak for what other people will do. I can speak only for what I would do. Now, I have the unfair advantage of thinking about DNA for 25 years. So if I see that my daughter has a sprint gene, I know what that means. I'm not starting to train her in the sprints right now, right? I know that, for example, she has, sensitivity to dairy. That's going to cause, an issue in terms of the inflammation that's going to affect training adaptation. I know that she's a slow metabolizer of caffeine. Obviously, that's not a problem for her right now because she's 2, right? So the fact is that, when that becomes something that she's prescribed later, oh, well, maybe take this pre-workout drink. It's like, no, we won't do what everybody else is doing because that's just not good for you. And, that it actually, we need to think about it like biologically on the long-term athlete development series, which are pretty, let's say involved insofar as where the athlete is. Like in the beginning, it's just like, it's play. And then it's, then it's like get exposure to as many sports as possible. Like before you're 13, 14, 15, 16, right? And then if there's something there that you kind of, you see, because that's like, it's the accessibility to, like, if you don't have ice, you're probably not going to be a hockey player, no matter what the best genetic hockey player looks like. I don't know if there is such a thing, but you get what I'm saying, right? Is you have to have access to the field where you're going to manifest any particular, let's say, aptitude for a particular kind of sport. But it's such a social thing too for kids at that age. And I see things like sport specificity is one of the bigger detriments. Like just not even talking about genetics yet is like kids specializing in at like age 12 and they're ready to win the junior Olympics. It's like, well, at what cost, right? I see kids in hockey at age 17 getting labral tears, and that just blows my mind. So I think that there could be no doubt like parents that might take this and overuse it or steer based on, really incomplete information when these are really kind of nudges and kind of marginal gains. And so I think there's a really great opportunity for the education of parents. I mean, I do imagine a future of athletes having a PhD in their own body, and that would include a genetics unit, let's say, but they would learn all of those other things about, human development and their, biology, the nutrition, sports psychology. And so I think like having a genetics layer that's available, like where, genetic counselors are involved and the communication is facilitated across the different disciplines and the different practitioners so that you can minimize trial and error. Like you go into a physio and you get this like, pesky shoulder injury or hip injury and it's not anything manifesting majorly yet, but you can, kind of contextualize that as like, hey, let's do prehab and instead of rehab. That was one of the great things about working with this organization in Phoenix was that it was really atypical. It's like I went out to the track and it looked like organized chaos, like F1 pit stops of like they're like massage and chiropractic and acupuncture and athletic or active release therapy, like all happening and tuning up in the field, in the wild, where the athlete like was really going to benefit and iterate, on the service being the product rather than I'm going to see you once a month and I'm going to maybe remember some of the things that led to this thing and we're going to speculate. So I think it's part of like coming back to the parent that's really stewarding the child and we talk about the younger ages is, how do we, get that information into a place that's private and is safe and that's secure. And then we move it responsibly to the care team that's nurturing the athlete. So I think like that, like there's definitely a risk of, the parent taking all that on themselves and, with the greatest intentions, leveraging the wrong things.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing too that I was curious to get your thoughts on is you had mentioned, if certain, I guess, oversight committees, right, leagues, if it violates certain policies or ethical frameworks in terms of these athletic profiles or utilizing this information, probably in a way that does probably more harm than good. But what are your thoughts about when the governing body or the governing organization requires genetic testing? So like we have the IOC for the Olympics is saying in 2026, is it 2026? 2028.
Yeah, 828.
Right. When with the Olympics coming up in Los Angeles, that they're going to require testing for the presence or absence, basically, of an SRY gene. That's the gene that is on the Y chromosome, but it doesn't necessarily determine what somebody looks like or kind of the biological sex, because there have been athletes that identify as female, have an SRY gene, and maybe have androgen insensitivity, right? Or they don't respond.
Yeah, there was an 800
Testosterone.
meter. I remember an 800-meter athlete decades ago with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So my thought is, I mean, what do you think when you hear about different governing athletic groups potentially
Yeah.
trying to incorporate genetic testing, whether it's an athletic profile or something like this?
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, like about the limits of my expertise here, because like it feels like a policy question with stakeholders like far beyond what like me, one researcher or dad or former athlete can speak to responsibly. But I totally support fair sport. That's a value I hold. But fair sport and well implemented regulatory testing to me like they're necessarily the same thing. And I think the second deserves more skepticism, because we don't test today the same way we did before, but, you know, and just even taking a step that, again, answering only personally and not at a policy level, just from my own experience, like regulatory testing is, historically it's, it's administered the way it's administered. It's one of the most privacy invasive things you can imagine. So imagine you're an athlete, you finish a race and you have to provide a urine sample under direct observation. What that means is like pants down to your ankles in the stall with another observer there. I've experienced that. I've witnessed even lapses in professionalism. Because remember, these are just people running these processes and like talking about the particulars of athletes' bodies I don't think is this the best we can do? Like athletes, they have to file their whereabouts. Imagine that. You have to file your whereabouts and you can be tested unannounced at any time, including at family gatherings for Thanksgiving dinner. That's happened, right? And like, again, I support fair sport, but this is the best we can do? I just wonder whether those costs are worth what they buy us in terms of this fair sport question. So, specifically to like the 2028, yeah, I think SRY policy. I mean, I don't, is it just women that are being tested? I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with
Yeah, so they're
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
testing all athletes, just those that are in the women's categories.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've already answered it by the previous. Sorry, it's a little too personal and close to home, I guess, in terms
Yeah.
of, and I think about like my daughter going through that, and I'm like, it just, I get it's like you sign up and you sign and you sign the waiver of like this is what we do, but like really,
And
yeah,
sometimes I think you're like, we've come so far in terms of like genetic technology and innovation, but utilizing some of it, I'm like, I agree with you. Is this the best that we can come up?
yeah, and I come back to like I really like Stephen Jay Gould's book called The Mismeasure of Man, and he talks about undue emphasis on particular biomarkers. I'm not saying that this is undue emphasis on the SRY gene, but I do think that there's like a bigger conversation, and I'd love to be in that room where those conversations are happening to get a full and complete understanding of the richness of the different opinions and different concerns, the different perspectives, I suppose, that lead to these decisions.
Well, and we'll finish on kind of again a more philosophical note. It's something that chatted about on your podcast, but I would love to know
Yeah.
your thoughts about it. Is the genetic inheritance like our genes are destiny? Are genes the end all be all? Or my favorite line, as I've mentioned before, Gattaca is like, is there a gene for the human spirit? Do genes tell us everything?
Yeah. And I think the question you sent me previously had like to do with like a very real example of how this might affect our future. And that's on like embryo selection and selecting embryos based on like athletic traits. And I think, probably from was hinting at our conversation on your podcast is that categorically that's like a huge error on so many levels. I mean, like embryo selecting an athlete, like scientifically, like the claim doesn't hold up, like everything that we just talked about today. Athletic performance is, yeah, it's driven by like an infinite number of possible variables, from the DNA interacting with the environment to the behavior, the strategic stress, our ability to even predict a phenotype from the genotype is, it's not absolute. So I think that, like there's a lot going on there. And you mentioned kind of like a spiritual frame and even like an an existential and ethical question worth sitting with and with like a parent when you make the choice. And I'm not judging any parents that make a particular choice around, say, embryo selection for Huntington's or, you know, any of these like Mendelian traits or a rare disease, for example. But there's, I'm stepping outside of my science hat now, saying there's something, I guess, about love, excuse me, love and compassion and our capacity to nurture, however the child comes into the world. Right. And so I don't mean for this to sound harsh about pre-selecting away from difficulty or selecting towards excellence. And I'm not advocating for a lottery either, but I do think that there is something more to it than, certainly in the case of human performance in sport. But again, like biologically, there's so much that we owe our survival to, like we owe so much of our survival to the variation in a population, right? And and so the fact that we're here is because we're carrying a whole bunch of good genes or bad genes, which is that language is totally insufficient because sickle cell in one environment is bad and in another it's good, right? Like the resistance to malaria, for example, versus, clotting heart disease. So I'll answer it more kind of like, I guess, sci-fi. Like, I don't know if you remember like Superman and Man of Steel, right?
Mhm.
Like of all places, like there's, Superman carried the codex of all the Kryptonian variation. So it wasn't just Superman and he's the Superman, the pinnacle of his Kryptonian species. He was all of them. It was all injected in and he was kind of sent out as a seed into planet Earth, right? And he had it all. Yeah. So all the good, all the bad, which, as I said, that language is insufficient, but it's the natural variation, I think, is such a gift that we have, and we don't fully know what we would be losing if we started to select away and subtract from that at scale, right? So yeah, I guess my thoughts about this space is, um, you know, being very skeptical of a company offering athletic trait selection, but a direct answer to, the human spirit side of things, like I think we're aligned here where genetics is not destiny. That heritability, tells you, how much of the variation in a trait is genetic in a population on average, right? But there's so much more unknown. There's so much more that like the spice of life will unfold, right? And, you know, jumping into the supernatural. Yeah, I've come to the realization I started at the top of the call, the selfish gene and the perfect reductionist theory. And if a billion monkeys were typing on a typewriter, they'd produce Macbeth. I don't know, maybe. But the more and more I live and I see like the wonder around me, especially in the next generation, it's like, yeah, I kind of think I'm just wearing like this meat suit and there's something more that's been imbued therein. So yeah, a gene for the human spirit. I'm sure that, others, my former academic counterparts, this will create some lively discussion, but I would say, no, I'm not there. Give me my belief. It's like that scene from, one of the Narnias, right? Where the queen captures the youth into like believing that, Aslan never existed.
Right.
And right. And so they're like, maybe that's true, but I have Aslan in my imagination and I choose Aslan. So final answer.
I love it. Well, and I know we're going to be wrapping up because you got some other things to do, but I do feel like I could talk for quite some time. So I just appreciate you taking the time and being on the program.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Yeah, let's plan to do it again and do like one of those 3-hour long form ones that just go where they may. Definitely get an in-person one if you're up for it.
Yeah.
Definitely get that on the calendar. I'd love to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be excellent. All right. Well,
Amazing.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. Again, congratulations on your recent award. Yeah,
Thanks.
amazing.
And then just shoot me an email. You may have to do, if we need to set up a Dropbox, I don't know how long big the file is going to be.
I think it's the same. It should, and as soon as it finishes rendering, I'll hit the share, and you should just get access to it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you
Amazing.
so much.
Thank you, Kate. It was awesome.
For more information about this episode, visit allaccessdna.podbean.com, where you can also stream all the episodes of the show. Any inquiries on the podcast can be sent to allaccessdna@gmail.com. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. This helps other people like you discover the show. Note that this podcast is for entertainment and education and is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Please consult your physician with any questions you may have regarding your health. All Access DNA is an independent podcast hosted and produced by me, Kate Wilson. Designs by NKJ created the logo. Thanks for listening and join us next time.